I produced music for a really long time before I really understood volume. And I think that before we go learning compressors or limiters, we should generally learn volume properly so that then that helps inform us when we use compressors or limiters so that we use them properly. And so inside Ableton, we can ask ourselves a few questions. Do we know why the volume faders start at 0 dB? Do we know why they go +6? Do we know why they work in negative? So inside of a digital audio workstation, we use a scale of volume called Decibels full scale. And when we're dealing with this volume scale, 0 dB is considered full volume, or the loudest something could be. And a great way to imagine it is like this. You have a glass of water. Just an empty glass, and you start filling it with water. Eventually, when you get to the top of that glass, you can't fill it anymore, and the water will just spill over the side. Well, this is a very easy way to understand digital audio. There is a digital container that exists, and if you just keep turning up the volume of that audio, eventually it gets to the limits of the container, which is 0 dB, and then any signal that goes above 0 dB will be cut off because it purely cannot exist. And this process of cutting the signal off is called clipping, okay? And so you can actually visually see it here in front of us. As I've turned the gain of this kick drum up, the top part of the kick drum starts to just go off the screen. And so what we're getting a visual representation of this on the screen here is that the top of that here, that top area is 0 dB. And when we start going above that, well, anything above that is lost. It's chopped off. And we start to hear it when it really gets quite extreme, because you can get away with chopping a little bit of the audio off when you don't hear it. But if you go really out of your way to push the point, you can really start to hear it. So I'm going to give you a demonstration of that right now. This is what digital distortion sounds like. So I'm going to go ahead and solo the sound, press play. We'll make it big so that, oh, that's the wrong one. We'll make it big so that we can see the waveform quite well. And now we're going to start pushing it up in volume. That's distortion. And so we need to understand how to avoid this process and how we can maximize the volume of our music, because we might be exporting tracks and they could be quite low in volume compared to professionally produced music. We could be exporting our tracks and it could be so loud that it distorts and we don't know why. And so this is the reason we need to understand volume properly, because then we can maximize it in a really intelligent way. And so I'm going to teach you a concept today that is going to help you mix your tracks, and it's going to help you achieve loudness without any destruction. And so it all starts with the kick drum. And so what we want to do with this kick drum is we want to set its volume, okay? And what we want to understand as well is the different ways that we can actually determine what volume the kick is. So like I said, in decibels full scale, we're dealing with decibels, and we're dealing with 0 being the loudest, and then we move in a negative from that downwards. Okay, so when I'm looking at a fader here in Ableton, we'll play this sound again, and we'll take a look at it. What we're looking at here is the fader with kind of two different color schemes. Down the bottom, you've got this bright green color. Up the top, you've got the sort of darker colors. So what we're seeing up the top of the fader is the peak level of that signal. And you can also visually see it here on the waveform. The loudest parts of that signal are these peaks here. And so that's what's visually represented here. And this number up here in Ableton is actually telling us what Ableton has observed as the loudest peak level, okay? And so you'll see that change as we go through this part of the signal. It jumps up to 0. So we're hitting 0 dB at that point in the signal, and it fluctuates a little bit. It's always a little bit different in the sample. But that is more or less our peak. What the other part of the signal is showing us, that brighter green part, that's showing us the RMS value. And this RMS value is an average volume. And it looks at a period of time of about 300 milliseconds in which to determine what that average volume is. Okay. And so another concept that we need to understand as well for maximizing volume is a concept called headroom. And so headroom is the distance between the peak level of the signal and 0 dB. And so, for example, in this audio file that we were just listening to, for most of it, there's about 3 dB of headroom. But when we get to this area here, we run out of headroom. It goes to 0 dB. And so that means is that there's no room above the signal where we've kind of got space or a safety amount of volume available to us before we would start just losing part of the signal, right? So headroom is kind of something that you can imagine as like a safe space that you've got where you know that when you're adding lots of different sounds together, the result of all of those sounds being added is not going to sort of exceed 0 and get too loud. So if you keep headroom for yourself, you know you've got like safe space. And generally speaking, with modern electronic music production, people say that you can export your track and have at least 6 decibels of headroom, and this is great. And yeah, that's exactly right. That's what you would expect to send to a mastering engineer. And I'm going to show you a way of making sure that you've always got at least 6 decibels of headroom. And so we understand headroom, we understand how the faders work, okay. We don't fully understand why we have multiple ways of controlling the volume there yet. And we don't really know why the fader goes to +6, okay. And so let's just kind of cover that ground, and then we're going to move on to this technique for you to maximize the volume in your tracks. And so when we are looking at Ableton, we have multiple ways of controlling the volume. And so the fader is the most obvious one. So we can turn that up or down, and we can go +6 with it, okay? But 0 dB is the loudest, right? And then we've got these gain controls. And on synthesizers, we've also got a volume control on the output of the synth, right? And so what we want to do is we want to have the audio in the channel at a reasonable volume, and we would use the gain control here to do that, okay? And so what we would want to do in the process that I'm going to teach you is we would make sure that on the kick channel, the fader is at 0. We're not turning it up or down, okay? And then we would use the peak level to indicate to us, if I just stop that, sorry. If I play that again, I would use the peak level looking here, or just looking at where it's peaking, to set the volume of that kick, because I just use the peak level. It's a nice and easy way of kind of measuring it, right? And I would make sure that I was hitting -12. And if I was not hitting -12, if I was too quiet, I wouldn't just come to the fader and turn it up, because first of all, I've only got a certain amount of way that I can go before I run out of an ability to turn that up any louder. What I would do is I would come to the gain, and I would turn the gain up. Or if it was too loud, I wouldn't come to the fader and turn it down, because I can change the volume of it at its source. This is the source volume for that audio file, okay? And so what I'm going to do in this case is I'm just going to leave it, because it actually is peaking at around -12. So that's perfectly fine for us, right? So why does that +6 exist? It's basically just a little bit of space for us to push the signal up a bit louder if we need to in some random circumstance, right? You'll notice on digital mixers or even analog mixers in the kind of world of using a mixing console, they have some additional space to push volume above that as well. And that can be useful in some circumstances just for quick and easy adjustments on the faders, right? But if we're following a process, we would change the gain, or we would change the volume of the synth in order to have it come into the channel at that volume. So let's move on to the next part. So what we need to understand is that when we have all of these sounds adding together, the result is going to be louder, right? So that's why we're going to say that the kick is going to be a -11, And then what we're going to do is we're going to make the volume of everything else in this track relative to the kick drum, okay? And so what do I mean by that? I mean, if I started playing this bass line as well, and I started bringing it in, I am going to set it at a volume that seems appropriate to the kick, right? And so somewhere around there is pretty good, right? And so on average, that seems to be peaking at around -12. It jumps up a little bit, but that's fine. And what we can look at now is we can look at the master. When these two elements are added together, you can see the RMS value is higher than both of them individually, right? So that means that the average volume when these two sounds are added together is a bit louder, which makes perfect sense. Now, if we bring in some other, I'm just going to turn all the faders down on these, and I'm going to bring in this next element. And somewhere around there is fine. That'll be fine. Just going to do it really roughly and really quickly. Okay, so we've got a bit of a rough mix now. And if we look at the peak level for everything, and we look at like the RMS value for everything, you know, we've got plenty of headroom before 0 dB. So none of these are anywhere near clipping, right? And if we take a look at our master, if we reset the peak level, we can see that the RMS value is around, let's say, -16, -14 on average. It kind of fluctuates a little bit, but it's quite solid there. And then the peak level is -7. So if we take a look at all of these peak levels, none of them individually are that loud, but when everything is added together, it gets to -7. And what that means at -7 is it means we've got 7 decibels of headroom. And so if we follow this process of mixing, then we can get to this sort of average target of making sure that we've got 6 dB of headroom, okay? Now, you may run into problems, and the problem could be something like this. This is probably going to be the best example that I can think of. So if we are playing that again, I'm like, damn, the bass just really isn't loud enough. And I come here to the fader and I turn it up and I'm pushing it +6 and I still don't have it at the level that it was before. This can be a little bit of a beginner's trap. Okay, well, what do I do? Well, let's go back to those principles that we were looking at before. If I just pause and stop everything, a good way for you to approach this is to do the following. Press play on the sample, leave the fader at 0, and go to the gain control or the volume output on the synth. And bring this up until you hit about -12, like we did before. Okay? And so now we should have enough volume. So what you can do for all of your sounds is get them to peak at around -12 or even -6 if you want to, as long as you've got plenty of headroom and nothing's getting near 0. That way you have much more control on your fader. So when you're actually mixing the track, you're not running out of volume. Okay? When you want to push something louder, you're not running out of level. And so that is how we can get a good mix and how we can get a good average volume across everything. But we have another issue that we're going to run into. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pop all that back. So now we're going to say that our track is well mixed. Actually, another thing just to consider. Imagine we've got this kick drum and we're thinking a little bit later on down the track, oh, I would like to add a little bit more bass to that kick. If I go and grab like a plugin such as an EQ and then shelve the low end, we're increasing the volume of the kick. And we want to be conscious of the fact that we're doing that. Because if we start turning the kick up, in volume, then we can start chasing our tail, because if we turn it up, we may lose the balance of everything else, and we might start turning up or down other things. And so if we always keep the volume of our kick the same, then this is going to be a better approach for us to, like I said, not start chasing our tail. If I exported this track now, we could run into some issues, because it may just not be loud enough, because like I was showing you when we played it, we've got about 7 dB of headroom. And so what this means is that we could be 7 dBs at least quieter than somebody else who's exported their track and sort of just turned everything up, right? So what do we do? Well, we need to first of all understand volume standardization. And then once we understand volume standardization, we need to know a little bit about a limiter and how it works. And then we can achieve a good target volume, okay? And so loudness standardization exists because of the fact that if you were watching television and one show was louder than the other, you'd be turning up and down your television all the time. Or if you're listening to something on Spotify and one track's louder than the other, you're chasing your tail with the volume. And so we've standardized volume so that we don't have loudness wars and we don't have people just trying to achieve super loud tracks. And this is useful because now people aren't crushing the dynamics out of their tracks. So the quietest part versus the loudest part is what we're referring to when we're talking about dynamics. And so we've got... with Spotify, we've got a standard target that we want to achieve. And it's a value called LUFS, which is loudness units full scale. It's a little bit different to decibels, but it's easy to understand. And it works more similar to how the human ear actually perceives loudness, okay? And so we have a standard level of LUFS that we should achieve, and that is 14 LUFS. That's what streaming platforms ask for, okay? And so if we get a volume meter that can measure LUFS, then we can make sure that we're in that target range when everything's playing together. And if we're not, we can use a limiter to increase the volume of everything until we get to that point. And this is a basic tutorial, so we're just doing it in a basic way. But there is obviously another layer of complexity to this, where if we were really to go deep into dynamics and maximizing volume, we would be covering some more advanced topics, but we're not going to touch on that right now. We're just going to do a very basic master of our track, so at least we're in the ballpark of volume. So what do we need to do? We need to get a volume meter. So I'm going to go to my master here, and I'm going to get a free plugin that measures LUFS. And I'm going to chuck that on the master, okay? And so this is a meter that will tell us the integrated value of LUFS. And so if we press play and we let it read what the volume is, just give it a little bit of time, we're at around negative 22 LUFS, okay? So we've got a wee way to go until we get to negative 14. And it also shows us our dynamics. And this would be something that if you want to get a deeper understanding of mastering at a more advanced level, we're going to need to understand that. So you can start looking into that if you're curious, right? And the loudness range. But what we can see on here are two pieces of information that we're interested in. We've got a negative 7 dB true peak. Okay, so we want to understand what true peak is. And then we've got the integrated value, which is like an average volume over a period of time that we're looking at in our track. And so the true peak is the true peak volume of our audio as it's playing. And so we're negative 7 dB. So what that means is we've got 7 dB of headroom like we were talking about. And this is important because we've got two measurements that are something that we need to be concerned with when we're looking at uploading something onto Spotify, is we need to be 14 LUFS, but we also need to have negative 1 dB for our true peak max, okay? And we can use a limiter to set that. And so let's grab a limiter. So we're going to go Pro L. This is a Fab Filter plugin, and it is Fab. And we are going to put it up here. And we are going to take a look at this first. So this is our output level, okay? And so if we want to be negative 1 true peak, we can go in here and we can say negative 1. And what that's effectively saying is that no matter how much we turn up this limiter, we don't go over -1 true peak. And we can keep an eye on that, and we can make sure it's honest by watching this, and we can watch our peak level up here. So now what I can do is I can start pushing volume to increase our LUFS. Okay, and I'm just going to exaggerate things a little bit. I'm going to go something like that, right? And so if I reset my meter here, I can press that, and you can see I'm really pushing this quite loud, and you can see all of the gain reduction that's occurring. So what the limiter is doing is when I'm getting to that point, to that -0 dB point, and I'm pushing signal above it, it's pushing the signal back down. And it's trying to do it in a way where it doesn't make too much of a mess of the signal. But we're really quite significantly pushing the peaks of this signal down. And we're way too loud now for our integrated LUFS value, okay? And so what we need to do is we need to strike a balance. We need to bring that down to achieve our target, so that we're not crushing too much our signal. But what we can do is we can look at the true peak here, and we can see that we more or less maintained that. And so the limiter was doing a very good job of stopping the signal going above that. And we didn't really hear any very obvious distortion because we're not going over 0. So we're not actually losing signal. We're just hearing the sound of the compressor trying to push the audio down in a transparent way, right? And so what we did do there, though, just to give you a little bit of an example, is we reduced our dynamics, because the quieter parts of the signal keep coming up, but the loudest parts of the signal are getting pushed down by that limiter. So the difference between the quietest part and the loudest part is getting narrower. So our dynamics have reduced, but in this case, we're not going to squish our dynamics. We're going to reset everything, and we're going to bring this up, and I think that if we go around +9, we might get in the ballpark. Okay, let's push it a little bit more to 10. We'll reset the LUFS meter. Cool, we might even be a little bit too loud now, so we can back that off. I'm going to go there. Cool, that's looking pretty good. We're more or less in the ballpark. Maybe we just want to go 9. And so what we're doing now is, yes, we have more dynamics. So the difference between the quietest part and the loudest part is greater. So we may not be as loud sounding as other music that has less dynamics, but our true peak is -1. And we're only very gently pushing down the top parts of that signal. So we're absolutely not anywhere near clipping. We're at our target volume, and we're not squishing our dynamics. And so this is a very nice and straightforward way of just getting a relatively loud track without overdoing it, and this is perfect for a beginner. And so when you export this track out of Ableton now, you should be nice and loud. And if you always export all of your tracks out, trying to achieve these numbers, then when you even play them next to one another, and you're comparing your different work, it's not going to be like one track's way louder than the other. And you're going to start getting a good way or a good understanding of how to average everything out. And so hopefully you learn a lot from this video. It's pretty action-packed, so watch it as many times as you need. Thanks very much for your support, and I'll see you again soon in another video.